Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are on the world. I am Jeffrey Sachs, Director of Research at the Agnon House in Jerusalem. Welcome to you all. I'm very happy and very pleased to welcome for a conversation today my teacher, my mentor, my friend, Professor Ruth Wisse. Ruth is the Barton Peretz Professor of Yiddish Literature and Comparative Literature Emerita at Harvard University and is the Distinguished Senior Fellow at the Tikvah Fund in New York. Her most recent book, there are of course many that preceded, but her most recent book is Free as a Jew. In the links here on Zoom or Facebook or comments down below if you're watching afterwards on YouTube, there's a link to more information about the book. It is, well, the book is pitched as a memoir, and it does contain those memoiristic aspects that readers of memoir will recognize, but I would say it's maybe even more so, correct me if I'm wrong, it's a kind of intellectual autobiography. It's a kind of roadmap that allows us to follow, like so many breadcrumbs, the map of how you came to occupy the role that you do as a significant public intellectual in the American and Jewish worlds, and how you came to the beliefs and positions that you are, frankly, very well known for. I think that's an accurate description of the book.
Indeed. Well, that was exactly what it was intended to be. Mm-hmm. The book is not very personal. And in fact, when I wrote the chapters one by one, and they were published originally in Mosaic, there was a little bit more personal information about, things
youth and childhood. And
yes, it seemed to me interesting in general. But since I had meant it to be exactly as you say, not just a cultural roadmap of my own development, but basically having realized that I was to some extent a witness to my time, as well as a participant in a tremendous evolutionary process. That was what the editors encouraged me to bring out and to subordinate even the remaining personal information that still was there. So there's very little about the things which are most important to me in life, my husband, my children, my family, and so forth. There's very little of that. And mostly it is, as you say, how my intellectual life developed.
Well, again, the book is Free as a Jew, and in the links, comments, you can find more information about that. You can also find information about an upcoming podcast series Ruth will be doing with the Tikvah Fund, which perhaps we'll talk about later in our conversation, and also information about Agnon House's upcoming summer traveling seminar of Prague, Vienna, and Budapest, exploring Jewish life, literature, and learning. That is a tour which will be conducted in English. So I like to say, God willing, COVID willing, and now Mr. Putin willing, we will be traveling in July to those locations. And I invite you to visit that link for more information about that. When you and I had initially planned tonight's session a number of weeks ago, well, I guess we knew there was some saber rattling going on the Russian-Ukrainian border, but I guess we couldn't have known that we'd be in the middle of a very traumatic war that is taking place in Ukraine. I should mention you were born in what today is Ukraine, although of course back then there was no country called Ukraine. You were born in Chernovitz. You came to North America, to Canada as a very young girl, and but yet, as I often say about Agnon, you can take the boy out of Buchach, but you can't take the Buchach out of the boy. There is something about the world of Eastern Europe which has remained with you. And of course, people that are familiar with your writing and your scholarship know that very well. We had decided in our initial conversation that we weren't going to talk about politics tonight. We were just going to talk about literature, as if anybody who knows Ruth Wisse thinks those two things can be separated. It was fool's errands to begin with. But I just want to draw our participants' attention to, I think, a very trenchant essay that you published last week in the Wall Street Journal entitled, "Why Does Ukraine Have a Jewish President? Ask Isaac Bashevis." Friends, you can Google this and find it on the website of the Wall Street Journal, Ruth Wisse's op-ed from March 7th. And you draw our attention to the Jewish author Isaac Bashevis, and particularly his work, Red Cavalry, which is a work that I had the opportunity to read and study a bit with you. Tell us a little bit about Bashevis, and tell us a little bit about that particular work, and then we'll get into why it's relevant for the traumatic current events.
Well, Bashevis would keep us here for weeks, months. He never ceases to overwhelm me. Really one of the most astonishing writers. And in 1920, as a way of, learning more about what to write about, and just because he always pursued what was happening in Russia at that time, he became attached to the Red Cavalry unit, which he writes about in this book. And this was the first war that was waged by the Soviet Union in Poland, in the area which is today Ukraine. So there is Bashevis. He is not riding with the Red Cavalry. He's not riding with this Cossack unit into war as Isaac Bashevis, but under the assumed name of Lutov, very Russian name which he has taken for himself. And he's there in a double capacity, even formally in a double capacity. He is supposed to be the correspondent, right, for the newspaper of the cavalry unit during the war. He's supposed to be a correspondent for the Red Army newspaper. But at the same time, he is a spy, basically. He is there as a propagandist. He's supposed to be teaching. He's supposed to be forming the new Soviet Union, taking this Cossack regiment that he's riding with, and somehow educating them, bringing them along. And of course, really he is there in a third capacity, the only one which ultimately comes to interest us, and that is that he's keeping a diary, and he knows that what he wants to draw from this is a work about, I think, if I'm not mistaken, war and peace. Mm-hmm. I think that even then, young as he was, he saw that the new War and Peace, that new Tolstoyan masterpiece, was going to be written by Isaac Bashevis. Of course, it was going to be completely different, written in the form of stories, written in a different mode, written by a Jew. But the idea was, I think, that the new Soviet Union was, after all, going to prove the fact that people were transcending their nationalities, that they were transcending, that Soviet Union was going to be the great international. So who could better voice the fact that a Jew was now the spokesman for the new Soviet concept of life, riding with a Cossack unit? What, in a sense, could be more ecumenical? Right. What could be more transcendent than he doing this, writing this work? Anyway, it is an astonishing work, very, very tough.
I mean, you observe, of course, that, Jews and Cossacks didn't always ride shoulder to shoulder as brothers throughout many hundreds of years of history. We know the water and the blood under the bridge there. But here, of course, we're living in a time that on a different Zoom the other night, we're almost at Purim, and as hard as it is to be humorous about what's going on, it's impossible to be humorous about it. But nevertheless, the farce of it, the idea that a Jewishly elected president of Ukraine is being attacked under the accusation that he has to be denazified.
Yes, yes, it is odd, but
it would be farcical if it wasn't so tragic. But you write in this essay in the journal that Luatov, who's a kind of autobiographical doppelganger of Babel to a certain degree, he's the hardest on himself in these stories. In one, he is ashamed of endangering his comrades in arms by not carrying a gun into battle. In another, he earns the lasting contempt of a friend when he's too squeamish to pull the trigger on a fatally wounded soldier who begs him to be shot. The most trenchant criticism comes when an officer tells Luatov, "I see right through you." In other words, the Cossack tells the Jew, "I see right through you. All you want is to have no enemies." And then Professor Ruth Wisse adds, "Denying enmity is not morality, but cowardice." And of course, we know that Babel paid a very high price for writing what he did, as a free man.
Yes, well, I would say that sentence, the last sentence that you quoted, was a very powerful sentence for me in my thinking about politics. I don't think I ever saw anything expressed in a way that shocked me to attention more than that sentence, because it seemed to me so powerfully true that there are some of us, and this is, I don't think, very characteristic of myself, but it's certainly characteristic of many liberal Jews that I know, and liberals in general that I know, that all you want is to have no enemies. Now, look, to want to have no enemies, as Luatov does not want to have, what's wrong with that? I mean, that's what the Jewish position in life has always been. I think the difference between the Jews constituted politically and other peoples, many other nationalities, many other nations constituted politically, is that the Jews have always accepted the principle of coexistence. Jews have never thought of themselves living other than as one among 70 nations. The idea, of chosenness never meant that you were going to be an imperial people. It only meant that you would be able to live among others, assuming that you could live without enemies. So there's nothing wrong with wanting to live without enemies. Mm-hmm. The captain, what his superior accuses him of, is of wanting to live without enemies when you have them. Right. And that is, a built-in danger to our people. And this is, when you introduced me, you said it was very hard to separate literature from politics, but this sentence, this one passage from Babel tells you exactly why. Are you going to read that in terms of its linguistic excellence, or are you going to just read it in terms of where it exists in the plot, or what? Clearly what he was saying there was something of enormous insight and importance.
Well, we're gonna leave Isaac Babel and Red Cavalry and in fact the crisis in Ukraine aside for the remainder of the evening, if we can, and we're going to come back to what our original organizing thought for our conversation was. When you and I had a chance to talk a while back, we remarked on the interesting constellation of 3 Nobel laureates. Of course, there were very many Jewish Nobel laureates in all the fields, and of course, even in literature, going back to the earliest years of the prize. In your book, Jews and Power, you catalog some of them, the different authors and the different years and the different languages that they were writing. This exceptional roster of Jewish Nobel laureates, you write, in so many different tongues, powerfully contradicts the essentialist connection between nationhood and national language that was postulated by the 19th century German philosopher Johann Gottfried von Herder. And it points to contrasting German and Jewish notions of identity. Beyond the disproportionate number of Jewish recipients, there are 3 unusual aspects of this statistic. The multiple languages in which Jews wrote, that they were winners in 2 Jewish languages, that's Hebrew and Yiddish, of course, and that one of those languages was Hebrew, which no modern Jewish community had spoken before 1900. How and why did Jews develop a relation to language that was so different from that of their neighbors. And we remarked that over the course of a dozen years ago, a half century ago, over the course of a dozen years, there were 3 Nobel laureates that we want to focus on. Of course, there have been others, and we're going to skip over Nellie Sachs, who was awarded the Nobel Prize in 1966, together with Shai Agnon, of course, here in Beit Agnon. We're rightly proud of Agnon, the first Israeli to win a Nobel in any category. To this day, the only Hebrew author to receive a Nobel, which he did in 1966. Agnon was born in 1887, although he always claimed he was born on Tisha B'Av, 1888, and he was a good old Galicianer. And although Yiddish was his first language, from a very early age, he sets his sight on becoming a Hebrew author, perhaps the greatest Hebrew author. In 1976, 10 years later, the Nobel was awarded to Saul Bellow, Canadian-born, American-raised, to parents who, although they had come from St. Petersburg, were good stock Litvaks. Wagner was a Galicianer, Bellow was a Litvak, and although Yiddish was his first language, and in one of your essays, you comment that he could have been as talented a writer in Yiddish had he chosen that as his mode of expression. He, of course, was a great writer in the English language, American English, and he wins the Nobel in 76. And just 2 years later, quite surprising, writing in what he himself, in his Nobel Prize acceptance speech, declared was a dead language. And he tries to explain in that speech why he chooses to write in a dead language. Isaac Bashevis Singer wins the Nobel in 78, the son of a Hasidic rabbi, born and raised in Warsaw, comes to America in his early 30s. And of course, he is a great Polish Yid. So we have a Galicianer, a Litvak, and a Polish Yid, all sharing the honor of receiving Nobel Prizes, all writing in very distinctly Jewish registers. This is curious. You suggested to me that we are not liable to see such a constellation again in our lifetimes. So before we get into that, explain to me what that means to you. Eino omer ele darsheni, as we say in rabbinic literature. This begs an explanation. These 3 authors being recognized on the world stage, although we shouldn't, even though we do in Beit Agnon, we do all the time, we should not make too much of a deal of the meaning of the Nobel Prize in terms of judging an author's worth. But nevertheless, these are 3 authors who are worthy of our attention and our ongoing engagement.
Well, the timing of it seems to me to be of great significance. It seems to me that there is a what I would call a period of grace in Jewish history, a very rare period of grace, and that is between the Second World War and the passage of the resolution at the United Nations equating Zionism with racism. This is a huge subject, but my contention would be that in those years, the Jews and Israel were a great liberal cause. People loved or were prepared to admire the Jews, accept the Jews. And that is really because of the timing. And that's the period within which these 3 got the Nobel Prize, as you say, not just 3 writers who happened to be Jews, which is the case with some of the other winners, but 3 writers who were writing as Jews and who were very known to be Jewish writers. I think that the fact that they got the Nobel Prize during those years were years when the Nobel Committee, which is highly politicized, was prepared to give multiple prizes to Jewish authors. Everybody thought that the Arab war against the Jews was winnable. Mm-hmm. And that made them great liberal cause. It's not just that it was after the Shoah and Jews had been killed so that they seemed like the victims of choice, but it's also the fact that Jews were the Ukraine of that moment, right? Everybody could see that this was 21 Arab countries, 5 Arab armies, everybody, against this Jewish state. So it seemed that the Jews were a good cause, a good defensible cause, but most of all, that they could defeat their enemies, they could stand up to their enemies, they would solve the world's primary refugee problem, right? Because they took in the Jewish refugees. No small concern for people in other countries, right? That there would be Jews after the war who would need placement. So those were the years within which those 3 writers got the Nobel Prize. But there's one other part of it that has to do with them. We don't often understand that in the 19th century, when we call the Haskalah, or the Jewish Enlightenment, or Jews entering into Western enlightened thought, there was about 150 or 200 year period when the greatest Jewish minds, especially among men, went into writing, not into the rabbinate. They couldn't have gone into politics yet in most countries because there was no Jewish country. What did they go into? They couldn't go into the army. Some of them went into law. Some of them went into, other professions. But think about it. These were the years when now Christians and Gentiles in general in Europe had been going into writing as the primary form of intellectual self-expression for many years, into drama, into poetry, into all forms of writing, and developing journalism as well in England, right? But the Jews had not gone into it in that great file because it was still, a boy went to yeshiva and wanted to become a great rabbi. That was how you got a good marriage. That was how you got status. And that was how you could live out your intellectual life. Now, for the first time, people flowed into literature. And, that's why Yiddish literature is so exciting to me, because for about 150 years, I would say some of the best minds went into writing of all kinds, and then into Hebrew as well, and then into the writing in all other languages. So you have in these 3 writers that are so precious, you have 3, think about it, 3 people who always knew that they were going to become the great writer of their time. This takes
in those 3 languages.
In each in his own language. They didn't have so much. Agnon was really the only one who had a choice of language. Right. He had a choice of language. I would say, though, Bellow, you were right. Bellow spoke the best Yiddish of any North American that I knew. He spoke wonderful Yiddish, but he didn't read Yiddish. His father had read Yiddish to him. He didn't read it freely. And though he could read the alphabet, certainly, he didn't pick up Yiddish books to read.
I see.
Not at all.
Well,
and Bashevis didn't really master Hebrew writing either. He couldn't have been a Hebrew writer.
But so he could have written in English. In fact, some of the translations that we have were written by him.
No, come on. No, that's very late in life. He was a writer before he even came to the United States of America. No, he didn't have the choice of language. But you see, what I'm saying is that they knew that they could make their lives as writers, that this was a very important thing for them to do, because they had immense egos. Each of them, was a tremendously strong, ego. I wouldn't say egocentric.
Right, as are most great creative geniuses.
Yes, but it's very hard to find people with that degree of self-confidence. And even Bashevis Singer, who's very funny because in his writing, he always presents himself as someone with no self-confidence, right. Someone who's bumbling along. Right. So I would say those 2 things combined. One, the political possibilities that made it possible for them to get the Nobel Prize. That is to say, for them to be lobbied successfully for the Nobel Prize. And on the other hand, to have writers who had already thought of literature as a...
Created such a realm to enter into.
Yes, exactly.
Well, this of course brings me to a rather well-known anecdote, which I'm sure some of our listeners have heard, but it's just so good that we can't have this conversation without repeating it. In 1963, Bellow edited a collection called Great Jewish Short Stories. It's a collection that's worth having. It took me some time to dig out my old copy, but you can find it on the secondhand book websites and on eBay and etc. Saul Bellow's edited Great Jewish Short Stories, if you're looking for a book to add to your library. In the introduction, he tells the following story. He's writing this in 63, but it's relating something that had happened in Jerusalem several years ago. I had an amusing and enlightening conversation with the Dean of Hebrew Letters, S.Y. Agnon. This spare old man whose face has a remarkably youthful color received me in his house. And while we were drinking tea, he asked me if any of my books had been translated into Hebrew. If they had not been, I had better see to it immediately, because, he said, they would survive only in the Holy Tongue. His advice, I assume, was only half serious. This was his witty way of calling my attention to a curious situation. I cited Heinrich Heine as an example of a poet who has done rather well in German. Ah, said Mr. Agnon, we have him beautifully translated into Hebrew. He is safe. Mr. Agnon feels secure in his ancient tradition. But Jews have been writing in languages other than Hebrew for more than 2,000 years. In fact, I guess we should observe that to be an author, a writer, a modern writer in Hebrew, that was the innovation, not writing in any other language. And then Bellow goes on, with less wit and subtlety than Mr. Agnon, other Jewish writers worry about using the languages of the diaspora. They sometimes feel like borrowers, compelled by strange circumstances to use a tongue of which their ancestors were ignorant. Now, this is the question. Obviously, Agnon is a distinctly Jewish author. Bashevis as well. Bellow wrestled with this question, and you, in your work, The Modern Jewish Canon, take him to task a little bit on this question, that he did not embrace his identity as what you see very clearly as a Jewish author. So can you speak to that for a moment on Bellow writing in English as a Jewish author, whether or not he accepts the mantle himself?
Well, I don't think it's true that I take him to task. As a matter of fact,
on this point, you.
Well, I'll put it this way. No, one of the points that I tried to make in the Modern Jewish Canon, and even more so on the book No Joke, which is a book on making Jewish humor. My point is that language is crucial to a writer. That's his body. You can't change your body. You have to, if you are an athlete and you want to be a great athlete, you have to understand what your body is capable of. If you are a writer, the most important thing for you to recognize is what your language is capable of. And are you going to become a great writer, making the maximal use of the language that you are given? That is the one thing that I've learned more than anything else about the study of Jewish literature, that it's not the kind of Jew that you are necessarily, but if you are a Jewish writer, the language within which you are writing, and that is dictated by the time and the circumstance as well, that is your prism. And it is so amazing to see how important it is for the writer to understand that. So let me just deviate for a little moment. What about Shalom Aleichem? He's one of the examples of this that is easiest to deal with. Shalom Aleichem began to be also one of the first professional writers who knew that he would be a writer, never wanted to be anything else. He wanted to be Balzac. He wanted to be Emile Zola. He wanted to be Charles Dickens. He did not want to be Shalom Aleichem. What, a humorist? That was not a great writer. He saw great writing in the European style, and that's what he wanted to do. And he started to write novels of that kind, a family novel, a romantic novel, and so on. Yiddish wasn't the tool for it. Mm-hmm. The Yiddish society was not like Tolstoy's society, where you could go from, through the army and through the nobility to the lowest peasant. Yiddish society was very different, and the Yiddish language was very different. His tool was very different. So within a very short period of time, he understood that what he could do was to be the great Yiddish writer.
And that was going to change the scope of what and how he was writing.
Absolutely. And to change, in a way, to change his voice, because he then changed his name from Shalom Rabinovich to Shalom Aleichem, to make himself into a comic character, to develop an oral style of writing rather than an omniscient narrator and so forth. And Bashevis Singer, of course, is a genius at this. I think Bashevis Singer has the richest Yiddish. You could match him with Shalom Aleichem, but perhaps even richer than any other writer. What he does with that, and what he does with that is, of course, very similar to Shalom Aleichem in some way, favoring the short in some sense, but then he saw how he could go, in some sense, literarily in directions as well. So that was the point that I was making also about Bellow. Bellow understood that he was writing in the English language, and now this is like Babel. You see, Babel found himself in Russia at a given moment, and that was the point I was making about him. He saw that he could be the great Russian writer. And do you know that when he wrote Red Cavalry, Gorky, who is at that moment the most famous Russian, most popular Russian writer of his time, Gorky wrote to Romain Rolland in France, Babel is the hope of Russian literature. Mm-hmm. He didn't say that Babel was the hope of Soviet literature, but he said Babel is the hope of Russian literature. Exactly what Babel had set out to do, using the Russian language and what it offered him. Well, Saul Bellow, a genius of that level, right? And when he makes his big break, listen to him. This is one of the most famous passages in American literature. And this is Bellow. I'm an American, Chicago born, right? Chicago, that somber. How did Chicago get to be that somber city? And go at things as I've taught myself, freestyle, and will make the record in my own way. First to knock, first admitted. Sometimes an innocent knock, sometimes a not so innocent, and so forth. I'm American, Chicago born. Well, he wasn't, right? As you said, he was born in Canada, and he was born but you see,
as a good Montrealer, you often observe this with a tinge of resentment. I take note.
Well, no, I don't think so. What my point is always, you see, what do you do with what you have? Do you understand what it is that is your particular métier? And I would say that, as it happens, The Adventures of Augie March is not my favorite Bellow book. And I would never say that it is.
What your favorite would be Mr. Samler's Planet?
Well, I would say that to me is his most important, but I don't know. It would be very hard for me to say, but among the great books, Seize the Day was in a way his breakthrough literarily. An astonishing book, which, by the way, you see, the Jew hardly figures in it at all. But if you look at that book, it's written right before, it takes place right before Yom Kippur. This is a book, Seize the Day. It's about a person coming to terms with himself, a very troubled American coming to terms with himself, happens to be a Jew. So when you look at the book in a certain way, you say, what kind of a Jewish character is this? He doesn't quote from Jewish sources. He quotes only American sources and British sources. But when you look at what Bellow's done with it, it is a reckoning on the eve of Yom Kippur. This is seize the day, right? Carpe diem. But no, not carpe diem in the Gentile sense, but seize the day in the Jewish sense of reckoning. So Bellow unabashedly says, yes, of course I'm a Jew. I could never be anything else but a Jew. And he would always talk like that about himself. You know, I would invite him to my classes often when I taught Bellow, and we lived in the same city in Boston for a while. When I taught Bellow, I invited him to come to the class. He was the most generous of persons. And he came. And when you asked him a kind of question about his Jewishness, he would say, listen, you know, when I grew up as the youngest of the boy in the family, we would open in the morning and I was wearing my tzitzit. What would I be other than a Jew? What else could I be but a Jew? But then he saw that at that moment in time, the Jew could become the great American writer. Just as Babel had seen that the Jew at a certain point could become the great Russian writer, Bellow realized that at a certain point, the Jew could become the great speaker for America.
By writing through the Jewish experience.
By writing as himself, exactly. Not having to falsify anything, but by
I know that you have less regard and affection for another author that shares certain parallels, and the two are often compared, Bellow and Philip Roth. So where does Philip Roth differ in this in your eyes? Besides the fact that Roth never got the Nobel as he would have.
It's not just that. It's not, well, you know, this is really not always fair because, you know, you have your writers. Yeah. I mean, I have writers who mean something to me. And Philip Roth was not one of them. I mean, I never liked his soul. I just never felt that he had a very powerful character. He was an extremely talented writer, and, made me laugh, and I appreciate much of his writing. But he's not my writer. So one of the reasons I don't want to write so much about writers who are not my writers is because as a teacher, as you know this too, you like to. That's why you're in Beit Agnon, right? You want to teach writers who
want to spend your day with people that you want to spend your day with.
That you most want to spend your day with. Not that you don't want to read them, and then not that you think, that they're worthless, by no means, but on a different plane. They're on a different plane.
Bashevis Singer undergoes this interesting transformation. Unlike Bellow's move from Montreal to Chicago is not so world transformative as the move from Buchach to Yafo, to Germany, to Jerusalem is, nor is it the same as the move from Warsaw to New York that Singer underwent. You observe that there are changes that occur in Singer's writing. And then Singer, of course, Agnon made these movements as a young man. Singer's already going close to middle age. You observe that Singer did not cast himself as a humorist except when playing to the United States public. So what did you mean by that? How do we see that differing across the different works?
Well, there's so much that one could say here, not lost in this subject entirely. You said about Agnon that he's a Galicianer. And by us, Litvaks, you see, Bellow is very close to me because he's much more the Litvak, right? But Agnon was sly.
Look up Galicianer in the dictionary, and that's the first definition.
Exactly, and he was in his spirit, and the same is true of Singer in this sense. Sly not necessarily being a pejorative term in this way, but they both had a problem. They both Agnon and Bashevis had a similar problem. They came out of a traditional Jewish life. What were they going to do with that? Clearly, they were not traditional Jews as their parents and grandparents had been. What were they going to do with that? Now, for Agnon, it worked out brilliantly. I mean, Agnon is the most fortunate in this sense that he realized what he could do, that this traditional past of his was able to be transformed to a very great extent seamlessly into Zionism, into realizing, into the redemption, right? Into at least the beginnings of the redemption of this. He's so wonderful, right? And it's so exhilarating in a way to see what he does with that, with the problems that are invested in that, and with how he plays with this material in various ways. But you see, his answer to Bellow itself was very sly. What did he mean by that? You know, it was a fanciful kind of playing with it. Bellow never fooled around with anything, and tradition was not a problem to him. Right. But it was most of all a problem to Bashevis Singer. Why? Because it's not just that he came from such a traditional family. It's like a pre-modern society that he was raised in, as he describes. But when he flipped, because his older brother had already become a Yiddish writer before him, and his older brother and his older sister, were already modern in a way that he became almost overnight. The difference is here that he so much disliked the alternative to tradition. You see, if you knew Bashevis Singer and if you follow his writing, he didn't want it known so much. But the thing that he detested most was socialism and communism. He hated certain aspects of Jewish modernity. He hated what they were doing to replace tradition. He found it wanting. He found it potentially corrupt. He never became a Zionist, you see. He didn't see that Zionism was a transition from traditional Judaism. He couldn't go that route. All he saw was all or nothing. And since he couldn't have the all, and especially after Hitler had destroyed that traditional Jewry, the voice within which he felt most comfortable was the voice of the devil. Right. The demonic reality was to him. And he could do that in Yiddish because he had kind of the Yiddish devil.
And so for Agnon, I would say I flipped my virtual background here to be sitting in his study. These books that we see behind me in Agnon's library, we have over 9,000 volumes of the traditional rabbinic bookshelf, as well as a very impressive collection of all of that world literature in translation, including Heine in the original German and Heine in the very good translation with which he is safe. Kafka, which Agnon pretended not to have read or hardly known, in the original German, and of course in Hebrew translation and etc. Tolstoy in translation, you name it, they're all on the shelves. But Agnon's achievement was to take the entirety. I agree with you that to channel it into Zionism is certainly true. Agnon was a Zionist, although not a completely unambivalent Zionist. And we see in many of his works, this is the greatness of Agnon, the ability to stand within a tradition or within a worldview and to still critique it. In fact, here we are, days before Purim, we know there's nothing more Jewish than to do that. That is the great tradition of the Purim spiel. But for Agnon, it was to take the entirety of this canon behind me on the shelves and to absorb it, to swallow it whole, and then to distill it and pour it out into the mold of modern literature. And in order to do that, in that regard, he had no option but to be a Hebrew author. He could not have done that in Yiddish or certainly in English in the same way. That's why I'm often, as somebody who's translated some of Agnon, I'm often asked, the kind of chauvinistic question by Israelis: how could you possibly read Agnon? How could you translate Agnon? Which of course is true for all great literature. How can you read Chekhov in Italian, and how can you read Shakespeare in German, and etc. But obviously, you can read Agnon in translation. You can read Singer in translation. You can read Bellow in Hebrew because he has now been translated. He is now safe. But for Agnon, the distilling of the Jewish canon into modern literature is almost the central theme of what he's doing. So in that regard, you're right. Yiddish is the perfect vehicle for what Bashevis needed to do. English is the perfect vehicle, the only vehicle open to somebody that wants to. That sentence, "I am an American," right, has to be written in English. But the project that Bellow was getting at had to be conducted in English. And for Agnon, it, of course, is Hebrew. I should just mention, of course, that Bellow himself, you mentioned that you thought Bellow could not have, really written in English, but Bellow translated. Didn't Bellow?
Yes, but therein lies a tale. He did. Yes, he did. But
Bellow translated Singer, or a few of Singer's stories, right?
No, actually, that is, I don't often pursue these literary puzzles. I'm not a literary detective. But I did pursue that because he translated Gimple the Fool. And because of Bellow's translation of Gimple the Fool, that was what brought Bashevis Singer world renown and American renown. Without that transition, he would not have become as well known as he was. He would not have had the entree into American publishing world. Right. So yes, Bellow translated Bashevis, but here's what happened. There was a sentence in that story, a couple of sentences in that story of Gimple the Fool, which were not translated in the version that Bellow created, which is brilliant. I mean, Bellow did a brilliant job of translating it. But there is a point, Gimple, Gimple doesn't recognize that.
Just in two sentences, remind our listeners
I'll just remind them of this one little point which is developed, which is here. Gimple is a Tom. In other words, he says he's not a fool, but he is simple in this sense that he doesn't recognize, for example, that when the boys tell him that the rabbi's wife, that there won't be any school because the rabbi's wife has just given birth, Gimple believes it. Why? Because he didn't notice that the rabbi's wife didn't have a big belly. And so they laugh at him. Afterwards, by the way, he's married to the town prostitute. She gives birth after 17 weeks, and he doesn't realize that the child isn't his. So this is Gimple's foolishness, as it were. It's a story that has its own unbelievable greatness. But however that be, when it comes to that moment, when Gimple says, "So I didn't notice that she didn't have a big belly. I went to the schoolmaster and he said, okay." He said, "Well, Adam and Eve went up 2 and they came down 4. And he said, and they say that Jesus didn't have a father." That sentence is not there in Bellow's translation. I said to him, "Why did you leave out this sentence that Jesus didn't have a father?" He said, "What are you talking about? I didn't know that it was there." So here's the thing, that Eliezer Greenberg, who was one of the 2 editors of the book for which this story was commissioned, read the story aloud to Bellow. Bellow sat at the typewriter, translating sentence by sentence. Orally, so brilliantly, orally. But he didn't know what was left out. So it is fascinating to ask why Eliezer Greenberg would that dig at Christianity translated, which is so funny in the Yiddish, right? But here's a point, bringing it to the American audience. Did you really want a story in English saying, hey, well, even, they say Jesus didn't have a father, which is obviously Bashevis Singer's wholehearted mockery of Christianity. But Bashevis Singer,
to the American audience.
Bashevis Singer, you know, I tell you honestly, he himself would have taken out that sentence later. He would never have written it once he knew that his stories were being translated for English, for English public, because he had become canny in that way. He had become sensitive to the English public. And he would not have wanted to do something which would offend them so dramatically.
We only have a short few minutes left, but I wanted to observe among your many books. Two of my favorite are Jews and Power, and No Joke, Making Jewish Humor. So the casual reader, the uninitiated reader, may think that these two titles, have nothing to do with each other. One is a very serious analysis of the Jewish relationship to power and how it's been represented in Jewish literary texts, and some of your own views, which we've discussed earlier this evening, are very much here on the surface. And No Joke, it has the Groucho glasses on the cover, and it's about Jewish humor. It's you look in the index, and you see all the great humorists and etc. But in fact, these are two books which are profoundly linked in almost every page, because your thesis is, of course, that for many years of exile, the only tool the Jew had in his arsenal was humor. The only tool we usually had was, or among the only tools we had, was that we were, more clever, that we could be more witty, that could both temper the bitterness of the exile, but could also somehow give us a leg up, help us explain our own experience to ourselves and to others. So these two books, reading them side by side, and just browsing through the index for our three authors that we're discussing tonight, although I should mention, again, it comes back to Babel. Babel appears, you're possessed by Babel. He appears in...
He appears everywhere because...
All of the authors. It's really, I hadn't noticed it until we started doing it. Babel appears throughout your work. It's a kind of, thread that runs throughout so much of your work, references and passing to Babel, aside from your direct presentations of what he's doing. But say a word about these three authors, Agnon and Singer and Bellow, and their relationship to this question of Jewish humor and Jewish power, and readers that will now run off to pull these authors off their shelves, or dare I say, make an encounter with them for the first time. What are they going to find on this topic, the intersection of these two things, power and humor, in each of these authors?
Well, Jeffrey, thank you so much for drawing all these things together and for paying such attention to what I've written. But actually, it goes much farther back than that. When I had to choose a thesis topic, when I was, after many painstaking years, getting to the point of writing my dissertation, the original topic that I had chosen when I thought I could write it in Yiddish literature was to answer the question, is there a humor tradition in Yiddish literature apart from Shalom Aleichem? But then my advisor had died. I had to change schools. I had to start all over again. And I had to do it within a comparative context. I had to do a dissertation that would in some way compare Yiddish with English. And I wanted to draw on what had interested me in the first place. Is there a tradition of humor apart from Shalom Aleichem? Well, I came up with this topic, the Shlemiel as hero, Yiddish and American literature. And that was how I wrote my dissertation. And if you go back to that, you would say, well, have you done anything new in your life? Because it's all there, actually. The Shlemiel, as I defined him, is the loser as winner. And it's not that humor was the only tool that Jews had in history. I would say faith, in a way, is the only tool that they had in history. Faith. I mean, faith that their ultimate bond with God was going to work itself out ultimately. But here's the rub. If you say, thou hast chosen us from among the nations, and you say that and you believe it, atah bachartanu, and you live up to God's promise, and what happens to you is the exact opposite in generation after generation after generation. How do you put these two things together? Well, the way Shalom Aleichem does it is, Ata bachartanu mikol ho'amim, was ist du gewollt von dein Volk Yisrael? What did you want? What did you have against the Jews? So
turns it on his head.
Yes, and this is Gimpel the Fool as well. And this is Saul Bellow as well in Herzog, which begins, if I am out of my mind, said Moses Herzog, that's all right with me. So this idea that you, in order to keep your faith in God, you somehow have to be prepared to be a fool in the eyes of others, or to lose on some level what you win on another. But you have to balance this extraordinarily difficult balance between moral self-confidence and political assault. Right? I don't think that has changed so fundamentally. Although, and so when I started to write about the book on the Jewish humor, I wanted to add a chapter on Hebrew, of course. They said there is no Jewish humor in Israel.
Uh-huh.
Well,
you prove very carefully in the chapter in the book.
I found it. Yes, I must say that even though I understood what they meant, that the chizbat is not exactly the same as Jewish humor. Nevertheless, because of this balance that I've described, there's plenty of the same Jewish humor in Israel at the moment.
Right. Well, you before we end, I just want to ask you to tell us a word about your new podcast series that's coming up, which is titled "The Stories Jews Tell." There's a link in the comments or down below, but it's www.storiesjewstell.com, which is being brought to us by our friends at the Tikvah Fund. What do you do in that series?
Well, it's a series. This is the first series that we'll try, see how it works. 10 works. Most of them are stories, but there are 2 poems on really a wide-ranging choice of the stories that we've mentioned. The only one there is Gimpel the Fool, which is one of the stories I would include. But there's a Babel story, not from Red Cavalry. There's a story by Nachman of Bratslav, a Peretz story, a Shalom Aleichem story, a poem by Anna Margolin, the American Yiddish poet, a poem of Sutzkever's, Avram Sutzkever, and a story of Hazaz, Chaim Hazaz, which I thought was one of the most famous Israeli stories, Hadrasha. It turned out that every Israeli that I've spoken to lately had never heard of it.
Well, in other words, an asterisk there. If they've read any Hazaz story, that's it. If they haven't heard of that, unfortunately, it probably means they haven't read or heard of much Hazaz to begin with. So,
well, the rest of Hazaz is, in a sense, much more interesting than that story, but it's a very iconic story. That story, Hadrasha, translated into English, is available in English as The Sermon, was on the Bagrut, on the matriculation exams. High school students would encounter it. It would often be the only story that they would encounter. That's how, for many years, it had taken a central role in people's consciousness. Exactly. That's what I had thought. But then it was dropped.
Unfortunately, like so much Bialik and so much Agnon and other things, the classics get whittled away each year. That may have been dropped at some point, but. That's
the series.
We recommend that to people. The Stories Jews Tell podcast series coming up, and of course the book is Free as a Jew, which I think when people will read those essays, they'll have a much deeper understanding of how you've come to some of the ideas you've shared with us. Tonight. And again, I remind people to check out information about our upcoming summer tour in July to Prague, Vienna, and Budapest. In the Jewish canon, you're channeling something that Robert Alter had said, and you say it in the context of Agnon, but perhaps it's relevant to everything we've said tonight. You write that although it is true that fiction offers no solutions to the problems of existence, only the imaginative and linguistic means for thinking about the problems, for seeing them with a depth of vision. What alter subsumes under the word only becomes in Agnon and perhaps these other great authors, a powerful solution. I think that that somehow summarizes much of what I've learned from you, what many of your readers and students and followers throughout the world have learned from you over these many years, and I think some of what we've heard tonight. So, Professor Ruth Wisse, thank you for your time, and we thank you for your ongoing teaching and inspiration. Thank you to all of you who've joined us from around the world on Facebook, on Zoom, or those that'll be listening afterwards on YouTube. Visit these links that we've shared to learn more. And we hope to be bringing you more conversations in English with other researchers and scholars and authors and people that can help us understand these areas of common concern over the next coming months. And of course, those of you who can follow us along in Hebrew, we have every week, a number of times a week, programs here on Zoom and on Facebook in Hebrew, and give us a like on Facebook to keep up to date with everything happening here at Beit Agnon. Thank you so much.
Thank you.